Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be speaking with you today. My name is Larry Zwier. I'm an associate director at Michigan State University in East Lansing. I've worked with Cambridge University Press on many projects over the years, and it's great to be part of this online conference series. Um, my presentation today is about it, it's inspired by something that we often hear from real estate agents. If you've ever been out shopping for a house and they talk to you about what you should be looking for, they always say the most important thing in shopping for a house is location, location, location. Uh, and it got me thinking that when you're thinking about teaching vocabulary, something similar goes on because collocation is one of the most important things that we need to communicate and add to the vocabulary learning of our students. Um, just a brief overview of what I hope to do today. You'll notice that for sale sign. First, I'll define some terms. I think you probably all have some familiarity with the basic vocabulary surrounding collocation, but we'll go through that. We'll uh, do some basic consideration of whether collocation matters, and of course it does, and how. Uh, then we'll mention some tools that students use in trying to understand collocations and in order to determine what some common collocations are. And then what I think is really the heart of the presentation, I'm going to describe a questioning strategy to you that I think is probably the main thing I can contribute to this debate. There's a lot of discussion about what collocation is and about what online tools you can use in order to explore collocations. But from a teacher's point of view, I want to describe a new way of using these collocation tools to answer some basic questions that students always have about vocabulary. First of all, collocation. What is it? Well, a collocation is a set of words that frequently occur together. They've got a certain likelihood of co-occurrence, but they're not necessarily tightly bound. Let's take a look. This is just a random text that I pulled out of, just went to a file, and this shows how easy it is to find collocations. They're everywhere. Uh, if processes were, well, when you would agree that when we've got a conditional like this, the if and the were very often occur together. Over the long term, very, very great friends. They very often occur together. Unable to, how to, on the moon, fight disease. These are all items where you've got an independent, you've got independent vocabulary items that are not so closely related that they form a new vocabulary item, but they are very, very frequent cohabitors in a sentence. And they are, as we say it, collocates of one another. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do here was to show a search box from one of the more familiar corpus tools. Some of you may be familiar with the English corpora group. It's the group that of corpus tools that used to be under the byu.edu domain. I'm showing you this search tool not only because I'll eventually come back to it more and show you how it's useful in our questioning strategy, but it also illustrates some things that we need to know about collocations. When you're looking up collocations with this tool, the word that you want to find collocations for, and in this case, I'm showing the verb wonder, not the noun wonder, but the verb wonder. I've typed that into the word that we're going to search for. That's called the node. That's the word around which you're trying to find collocates. Now in this search box, they have several things labeled POS. That just means part of speech, so that you can specify, like here, I want to specify that I'll look for the verb wonder, not the noun wonder. And so I can use this part of speech thing to specify verb all. Um, Now, under that is a blank called collocates. You actually don't type anything in here. That will autofill once you choose from the part of speech option here. And what I want to do is find which prepositions are likely to follow the verb wonder. Now, I didn't just randomly pull this out because actually my students were building sentences a couple of weeks ago using the verb wonder, and they all knew that they had to follow it with some kind of prepositional phrase, but they were not sure, is it wonder to, is it wonder of, is it wonder from? They hadn't really got instincts about which preposition should follow it. Well, in this tool, you would put in prep so that you would be searching for which preposition would follow it. And this set of numbers, uh, this is what researchers call the span. That is, if you put your node in this blue box that is in the center of the span, you can choose to go a certain number of spaces to the right or a certain number of spaces to the left to search for your collocations. And of course, if you're looking for a preposition that comes after the verb wonder, you would search a certain number of a certain number of spaces to the right. Now, I've chosen 2 spaces here because there might be an incidental word like an adverb, wonder, wonder bemusedly preposition. So uh, this is, again, as a review, the node, the collocate, and the span. Now, just for fun, let's see what happens when we do this. Let's see what happens when we search for the prepositional collocates of wonder. Well, this is what you get. Here is the first 10 lines of the readout that you'd get if you do a search like we just did. And if that's not revealing, I don't know what is. You can see that very, very clearly, if a student goes through this routine, the student will see almost always, the preposition that you're looking for is about. Not all the time, sometimes other prepositions would be appropriate, but the student has a very, very strong statistical likelihood of wanting the preposition about after the verb wonder. And then let's say I got this readout and I wanted to find out, well, what does that mean? What kind of text would be uh, showing this? I would just click on about and I would get lines that look like this. I show this to you because it's, as we'll see later on, it's really important for the student to be able to not only see this statistically, but see how the statistics are manifest in actual text. Now, this is actually kind of clunky because this is a concordance. It's sort of a concordance that uh, it takes pieces of text, not whole elaborated text, but it does show wonder about in certain texts. And so the student can see it in an English medium. So getting back to what a collocation is, a strong collocation, because collocations can be strong, that is very frequent, or it can be relatively weak. But if it's strong, it will look familiar. That is, when you see it, you won't think, oh, well, that's just a nonce occurrence. What you will see it and you will say, oh, I've seen that before, like these phrases, rapidly deteriorating, cast dispersions. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever seen the word aspersions without cast next to it. One way to look at it, it became apparent. All of these things are strings of text, collocations that are highly likely. In fact, some of them are so highly likely that you can even predict how things are going to end here. We had torrential. Well, there are not a lot of things that could fill this blank. Rain is probably it, maybe downpours. Jake tried to get in using a fake. Well, probably ID, right? And the agency's response has been woefully, well, most native speakers are probably going to choose inadequate because for some reason, woefully and inadequate have grown up together. I don't know historically how long that's been, but we reflexively think inadequate after we see woefully. In fact, these things are so tight that we are approaching the line between collocations and multi-word units. That is, formulaic sequences that you wouldn't even call them collocations anymore. You would call them their own thing, separate vocabulary items. A formulaic sequence, and we have to talk about this term too, because a formulaic sequence is like a collocation that has grown so common and so strong that it actually has formed a new vocabulary item. It's no longer just two separate vocabulary items traveling together. It's actually a new vocabulary item on its own. You may have even seen this definition floating around because it's very common. Alice and Ray in 2002 said that a formulaic sequence is a sequence continuous or discontinuous of words and other elements, which is or appears to be prefabricated, and this is what really counts. That is, it is stored and retrieved whole from memory at the time of use, rather than being subject to generation or analysis by the language grammar. I highlighted stored and retrieved whole because your students, when they learn a formulaic sequence, or you, when you were learning English, you learn the whole thing. If, for example, the verb to pass out, as in to faint or to lose consciousness, you learn that in that meaning as a whole thing. You don't learn it as pass plus out. You store it as a whole thing, and when you need to use it, you retrieve it from memory as a whole thing. And the language grammar doesn't actually even apply as you retrieve it. Now, formulaic sequences, I've got a blue line here that goes from low to high just to show a rough increase in length, because formulaic sequences can be short, as in the phrasal verb follow through, and then maybe getting a little bit longer with complex prepositions like in front of, then on to compound nouns, which are usually short, but they can get pretty long. Multi-junction, solar, photovoltaic cell, well, but that's all one vocabulary item. That's not multi plus junction plus solar plus photovoltaic plus cell. That's one vocabulary item. And then you go on, a lot of adverbials, a lot of sentence adverbials are formulaic sequences. That is, they travel as a single unit, like if that's the way it's going to be. Or catchphrases. Those of you who have seen the movie Poltergeist may remember they're back. Well, that has achieved a cultural status here in the United States, so that now it's a kind of catchphrase, and it's known. It has a meaning beyond the simple meaning of those two words. It has a meaning of its own. On to cliches like "it takes one to know one," or opaque idioms. Like, this is what people usually mean when they say an idiom, although there are a lot of reasons not to define this alone as an idiom, but like make a mountain out of a molehill. And then it goes all the way on to sentential proverbs, like it's better to give than to receive. All of these things are formulaic sequences. They are all whole things. You remember them as whole things, not as various individual vocabulary items thrown together. Now, because they are whole and because the students who learn them supposedly do learn them whole, um, they have interesting properties. Ray was she's British, and she was saying that in 1993 there were some British TV ads for the Kellogg company that showed people being interviewed, and they were being asked, "So, what are Rice Krispies made out of?" The cereal Rice Krispies, and people couldn't say. They didn't think to say rice as what Rice Krispies were made out of. Why? Because when they said that word Rice Krispies or said that item Rice Krispies, they thought of it as a whole. They weren't thinking of it as rice plus Krispies. It was so whole to them that they didn't even register the word rice in its usual meaning. And formulaic sequences can also bypass grammar. And sometimes they preserve archaic grammar or lexis, like be that as it may. Nobody really says that with the with this transposition of a subjunctive be at the front, be that as it may, except in these formulaic sequences. And I'll show you a few more of those. You don't know the half of it. The half of it, in as much as leave well enough alone, you almost never see well enough as a noun phrase, except in this formulaic sequence. The peace that passeth understanding, well, that's 16th century English, but it survives in the formulaic sequence. Ray also pointed out, fancy seeing you here. Well, to my dialect, it's always fancy meeting you here, but in any case, you would never say this as a productive utterance. It's always a whole thing. It's always a formulaic sequence. Collocations, on the other hand, are not learned whole. Collocations float. Collocations are not there as a package for your students. They can be confused with formulaic sequences, but they're less firm and they're harder to discover. So as we go along and talk, we'll assume that students have learned fake and ID separately so that they must further learn that those two go together. And we're going to talk about tools that will allow students to learn this. I thought this was kind of a cool little cartoon. You know, what happens when the Trojan horse goes clubbing at night? But anyway, are collocations important? Well, that might seem like a silly question, but as you'll see, it's not silly to everyone. For one thing, a lot of people say, well, we don't really know because it's kind of hard to quantify a collocation. How do you even say how many collocations there are? Because they go on this continuum from weak to strong. How do you count what percentage of native speaker speech or writing is collocational? And if you can't do that, how important is it? It's a lot harder to calculate that than what percentage of speech or writing is formulaic. But one thing that I found that Conklin and Schmidt in 2012 brought up an interesting fact. Howarth looked at frequent verbs. These are general, normal academic use verbs in a social science academic corpus and found that they occurred in either restricted collocations, that is in relatively strong collocations, or in idioms in 31 to 40% of the cases. In other words, if you take this very frequent, important verb, about a third of the time, it will be within a context where students should not consider it on its own. They should either have learned it as part of uh, a larger formulaic sequence, or they will be seeing it in a collocation where they should be able to recognize it as part of a collocation. Collocational proficiency is a means of efficiency. Native speakers gain a great deal of efficiency by thinking of things as units, as you don't have to go word by word as you compose your utterance. You compose it in chunks. Collocational proficiency is also a sign of belonging. You know how to put together an utterance that sounds normal. And it's, I'd like to say, an instrument of art. And just to explain what I mean by that, the other day I got an email that said, well, the email subject line was thinking beyond the box. Read the MSU Today weekly update. And I thought, that's weird. That's not the phrase. The phrase is um, thinking outside the box. I wonder if this was written by somebody who made a mistake. And then when I opened the message, I saw, aha, it was by somebody in the packaging department, thinking beyond the box. They were they were toying with the collocation to make an artistic point. Are collocations important to learn? Beyond their theoretical importance, what is their pedagogical importance? Well, not everybody thinks they are important to learn. Brett Reynolds, for example, argues that teaching too much precision in collocations is unnecessary and reflects native speakerism. That is, reflects an unreasonable desire to turn everyone into somebody who sounds like a native speaker, when in fact they don't really need to sound like a native speaker, they just need to communicate. For example, you can probably understand somebody who would say they are law obedient people. They meant law abiding, but you can understand it. Or they had plastic operation, meaning plastic surgery. Or if somebody says they're having a midlife emergency, they meant crisis. Or that bronze consists of copper and tin, and they say from copper with tin. So, I can see that Reynolds has a point. And, I certainly am not one of those people who says that unless you sound exactly like a native speaker, you don't have good English. But I think that a more typical stance among researchers is that unconventional combinations of words can be perceived as foreign and odd, making learners less effective communicators. And here to me is the important thing, hindering their acceptance into the speech community. I think that as teachers, we have to recognize that that could happen, and we do have an obligation. My goals as a teacher are to include collocational knowledge through form, meaning, and use, and to provide collocational noticing opportunities, because my students do want to avoid as much as possible being outsiders. They want to become part of discourse in an academic community. Now, I know that I can't teach them enough. So what I really want to do is show students ways to seek the level of collocational conformity. That is, to make their collocations as good as possible in a way that suits their aspirations. And for most of my students, those aspirations include going to academic conferences, standing up with other professionals, and speaking in a way that is recognized as solidly within the academic discourse community. And so, since they're going to have to do this without me, I have to recommend some tools. Now, when I think about what tools to recommend, I think, do students have ready access to it? That is, if it's too bizarre and they can't get it, it's not going to be any good for them. Can it provide examples of intact collocations? Remember, I showed you those examples of wonder about in sentences. Students ought to be able to do that. They ought to be able to see the collocations in action. Can the tool be used with a few simple, easy to teach routines? If it's too complicated, they're not computer scientists, most of my students. They need to have something they can be easily trained up to. Is the tool comprehensive? That is, can it handle nearly every vocabulary item they want to work with? And then there are, it should be attractive. They'll use it more if it's attractive. And are its returns useful or simply accurate? If its returns are useful, great. That's what we want. They can be simply accurate. That is, showing that the collocates with almost every noun. Well, yes, that's true. That's very accurate, but it's not very useful. Now, I think you've all been given this as a handout. This is a list of tools that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. This list could be as long as your arm, and it's not my aim today to try to be comprehensive at all about possible collocational tools. But this offers, I think, a good mix of dictionaries and leveling tools and corpus analysis tools, and we'll be able to see some differences among them. So for the remainder of the presentation, what I'd like to do is to show you my questioning strategy. I'd like to practice framing word choice questions. That is, when the student asks, what word can I use? Or can I use this word here? I'd like to pose those as collocation questions. Now, why do this? To take advantage of the tools that I just showed you. And then we'll look at what happens when some of these tools are applied. Now, I fully realize that I'm using a sentence that has what you might call a first world vocabulary problem. That is, this is a vocabulary problem. The sentence has a vocabulary problem, but it's not like a very serious vocabulary problem. It's one of those problems that might make a social difference, even if it doesn't make a communicative difference. I am really engrossed in the people from Iceland. If a student has a question about whether that's appropriate, if they frame that question in its word choice form, they might say, I'm really interested in the people of Iceland. Is it okay for me to say that I am engrossed in them? That's in the word choice form. But if you frame it in the collocation related form, something like, do noun phrases like people from Iceland collocate with engrossed in as the node in the +1 or +2 position? That is, 1 or 2 spaces to the right, as we saw in our span. By reframing this question in this way, you can use this tool to answer your question. And I would enter it into this search box, this collocate search box this way, and I would come up with the top 15 things like this. You can be engrossed in conversation, music, conversations, work, witness, so on, so on. Inductively, the student would say, wait a minute, I don't see any people in here. Well, let's see, team. I guess a team is made of people, but doesn't look to me like that's a very likely collocate. So a student would probably, from this result, say, I don't think that this evidence shows I should say engrossed in and follow it with a noun phrase for people. Let's look at another first world problem with vocabulary. The girl wanted to go to the ice caves, but her mother denounced the idea. By the way, these are ice caves along Lake Superior in Michigan. They're really interesting. But anyway, if we frame a question about that in its word choice form, the girl's mother spoke out against the idea of visiting the ice caves. Spoke out against. I know that denounce means to speak out against. Is it okay for me to say that the mother denounced it? Well, if I reframe that question in its collocation related form, it would be, do noun phrases like mother collocate with denounce in the -1 or -2 position? That would mean just going to the left 1 or 2 spaces. Well, I'm going to show you how this one would happen if you ran it through several sources. The Oxford Collocations dictionary doesn't show any noun collocates of denounce. Not useful. Oxford Collocations dictionary, not useful. Cambridge Dictionary of American English shows a definition of denounce. Strongly and publicly, well, that would be a hint that maybe it's not a good use. And the sample that it gives shows the subject being a governor. That's a little bit different from a mother. If I go to Cambridge's online dictionary, I see about the same thing, but with 2 examples rather than 1. Overall, dictionaries are not helpful in trying to answer this question through collocational inquiry. Now let's use one of these English corpora search boxes. So I'll put in denounce, I'll look for the nouns that can occur in one space to the left. And this is what I get. Critics, activists, Republicans, speakers, opponents. You see others and people here, but except for those, you see that all of these nouns have something to do with authority or the public sphere. This is starting to make me think that maybe mother is not really in that group. Now I look a little bit further in the English corpora group. Instead of englishcorpora.org/COCA, I looked at englishcorpora.org/webword, or iWeb rather. This gives you an interesting little display. It gives you a definition. It gives you a collocates panel, which is kind of interesting. The thing is, they don't give you any information about the positioning of these collocates. And so it's a little difficult to tell what could be a subject, what could be an object. There's a little bit of problem there. Now it tries to clear that up a little bit in this clusters display. Like if we look at dot, and denounce, theoretically that would show you some subjects, and it does, and it's accurate, but it's not useful. He has, have, we're getting readouts that don't give us what we wanted. It's not customizable enough to give us nouns. It's giving us pronouns, it's giving us auxiliary verbs, etc. I put it into the skell.sketch engine. It gives me some examples, and some of these are a little personal. She, you, little bit more likely that a mother might denounce. And then Sketch Engine gives you a list of possible subjects, none of which are sort of even like mother. I would say from the predominance of evidence, mother doesn't look like a very good match for denounce. I'm going to give you one last example. Here's a poor student of mine complaining. I'm in Mr. Zwier's class, so I have to learn the vocabulary item in sync. In fact, they do. That's part of their vocabulary right now. No, not that in sync, the other in sync. Because Mr. Zwier is mean, he's making me learn not only its form, 2 words, how it's spelled, and its meaning, working at exactly the same speed or in rhythm, but also its use, usually adjectives, sometimes adverbs, somewhat informal, including what words collocate with it, in sync. Print dictionaries, they don't say very much. And unfortunately, when I looked it up in the dictionaries, I wasn't able to look up in sync. I had to look up sync and then find in sync underneath. When I looked up on Cambridge Online Dictionary, I once again had to look up sync. And I saw a few examples of it. But once again, I don't have very much information. Here I did KW, a quick list. That means keyword in context. Now you can do these on the Cambridge.Corpora searches, and in sync will show up in the middle, and then all of these colored pieces will show up on the side. It's a very hard readout to read because of all the colors, but if you learn how to read it, you can see that in sync with is very common. But it's very difficult thing for students to work with because it's visually very confusing. I ran it through Sketch Engine. It gives me some examples of in sync, and some of them are helpful. Some of them are just weird. My karma's not in sync today. I ran it through English Vocabulary Profile, and this I think is a real problem. English Vocabulary Profile had no entry, not only for in sync or sync, but also denounce, engross, engrossed in, engrossed, engrossed in. Wow, that's a gap. Remember I said that I'm looking for a tool that's comprehensive? If a tool doesn't have these things in it, it's not very useful to your students. These are real heartland words here. It's not very useful if your range doesn't include those. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here. Let's give a little recap of where we are. I showed you that usage questions can be reframed as collocation questions. I showed you that dictionaries, even collocation dictionaries, don't usually provide very good answers. Sources of multiple intact collocations, like we had with those concordance lines, are hard to find. One thing I didn't mention to you before is that a lot of them are full of sentences that are just swept up by tools called web sweepers. And so they are not curated, and you come up with really bizarre, sometimes obscene things from the web. It's very it can be very difficult to use and certainly not at your student's level and sometimes embarrassing. Corpus tools are better than dictionaries. And I didn't mention how how easy it is to train students to use these COCA searches. That's another presentation entirely, but I easily taught my students to do this in 10 minutes. iWeb searches, the one that had the display with the nice collocational table. It's sunnier, but its returns are unhelpful. And English Vocabulary Profile and Scale Sketch Engine are helpful, but they have a very limited range. Now, I'm very sorry that we're coming so that we don't have time to explore this any further, but I think we've got a few more minutes for questions. Do we, Drew?
We do.
Kyoko?
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah,
And before
sure.
the questions, I just wanted to reiterate that again, we will be posting a link to the webinar recording and sending you an email in 1 to 2 weeks from here, along with a certificate of attendance. And I think that Kyoko has collected some questions. And if it's okay with you, Larry, we're just going to have her read those to you so that you can answer.
Sure.
Great, thank you, Larry. That was a great presentation. We have one question. From your experience, what are the most productive ways to teach collocation?
Well, the very first principle I would say is show collocations in text. If it's something that you know students are going to encounter, like in a reading or something, come up with six to 10 instances of the collocation as it shows up in various other sentences, so that the student can inductively see the pattern and draw conclusions about it. One other thing I would say is that students are used to, they're not used to vocabulary, they're not used to you saying things like collocations, et cetera, but most of our students have gotten a basic grammatical vocabulary like subject, object, et cetera. And that's why I say frame your word choice questions as collocational questions, but you can frame them using those familiar grammatical terms. Like you can say, let's use the corpus tool to find what subjects go well with denounce, or what objects of the preposition in go with grossed in, engrossed in, something like that.
All right, thank you, Larry. I have another question. When and how would you use these tools? For example, if a student asks a question during a class, would you go through this process during class, or would you ask them to do it separately on their own?
Well, it depends on what the situation is. I have asked students to do it in class because they can do it on their phones. A lot depends on your instructional situation. If the students are like putting together a reaction, I teach a reading class, and if they're putting together a reaction to a reading and I tell them that I want them to use a certain number of vocabulary items that we've worked with from the reading, and they're trying to compose something and they want to know which words make good subjects or objects or whatever, I will sometimes say, now you remember what we learned about using English-corpora? Use your phone, find it. And they can do that. Now, if they don't, if the classroom doesn't allow that, I will usually just like write them a little note, like just sit right there, take out a piece of paper and say, special assignment for Tuesday, find out which object or which prepositions follow the word wonder, and then ask them in the following class what they found.
Great. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Um, how do you decide which collocations to teach at what level? And this is kind of a two-parter. Should it be taught in the basic ESL class, or should you wait until they have a little bit more vocabulary and language skills?
Well, a lot of them have to be taught in the lower levels because some we have to remember that collocations are not just a matter of higher level vocabulary, even lower level vocabulary in order to be learned in a usable way. You have to learn collocations to go along with it. Like it's very difficult for students to have even talk about homework without learning a collocation. They have to learn that you do homework, not make homework or create homework or whatever. Even a simple word like homework or dinner or bed, those are those are really low level vocabulary items. But if you're going to teach them and teach them in a conscientious way, you're teaching collocations even as you teach those low level items.